part of campaign of Russification, Russians cracked down on Polish nationalism, and the Polish nationalists resisted. There was a second revolt. The first one, we discussed this first one in 1830. Second one was 1864, and that's when the serfdom was abolished in Poland. And that's where Polish peasants received the preferences, received land. They were liberated with land. Good. Just to penalize Polish nobles. Attack on the Catholic Church. Monasteries were closed down, and later, it shouldn't surprise us that later the Catholic Church became one of the major building blocks of Polish nationalism to the present day. Even recently, in 1980, when Polish people revolted against Soviet domination, anti-communist revolt, headed by working class people. It's bizarre. So the major ideology was a Catholic ideology. It's not because everybody believed in Catholicism, but Catholicism was like an umbrella, that spiritual umbrella that united them against Soviets. It has historical roots because the roots of this Polish nationalism went back to the 19th century when Catholic Church experienced this abuse from the Russian imperial government, and that's when they started to view the church as part of their nationalism.
It also helped that there was a Polish pope.
You're talking about the current history, eh?
Yes,
of course, yeah.
With solidarity and with the...
Yeah, very different. This Polish pope was a kind of pro-Western. He defended Western civilization, unlike present pope, who is more socialist. The present pope, he was raised in the spirit of liberation theology. Liberation theology, it's like a mixture of Christianity and Marxism. In Latin America, some people preach it. So the present-day pope, he embraces this doctrine. I'm just saying it in plain language, without beating around the bush. But the Polish one was a die-hard Catholic, so to speak. So he defended this type of values.
But I think the point I was getting is when he went back to Poland, millions came out for the masses.
Millions, yeah. Millions.
Undermined the regime to no end.
Yeah. So it was a very powerful revolt that united the entire nation. Again, but it's a different part of history. It's the most recent history. Thank you, anyway. Second one, Finland. Finland became the object of attacks, which was very unusual because Finland was left alone for geostrategical purposes because it was close to Sweden. The Russian government didn't want to antagonize Finnish people. They actually incorporated Finnish elite internationally. Some of the prominent Russian military officers, in addition to Baltic Germans, they were Finnish people who were accepted in elite officer schools in St. Petersburg, were allowed into court. I will give you, since we're kind of jumping far ahead, you mentioned current history, I also want to mention interesting person from current history. Did you hear about Mannerheim? Mannerheim, who was a Finnish president, semi-dictator in 1920s, 1930s, who was fighting against the Soviet Union, was able to shield Finland from Soviet invasion. So he was an old Russian imperial officer, Mannerheim, who was born in Finland. He was part of the elite officer corps, was part of the Nicholas II court. So interesting things. Anyway, Russian media constantly criticized the successive rights that had been granted to Finnish people, and they did have excessive rights compared to Russians. First thing, army. Finnish people had an army. Of course, it was not full-fledged army. It was like a police force, but it was called army. In 1890, this army was eliminated, shut down, and Finland now had to be policed by the Russian police. Totally different story. Postal system, which makes statehood. If you have a separate money, separate postal system, it creates this mental border. So independent postal system was eliminated. Money was abolished. They even had money. At some point, they had separate money. They could use, Finnish people actually could travel to St. Petersburg, to different parts of Russia. They could use rubles as Russian currency. But when they were in Finland, they had to use Finnish currency, which was unusual. So now it was eliminated. It's the same currency all over the empire. Russian language, that was the most sensitive thing for Finnish people, because at this time, Finnish nationalism not only was emerging, it was solidifying itself. Okay.
The PowerPoint says the currency was not abolished.
It was abolished eventually. At first, wait a second. I have to cross. Thank you.
Yeah.
Currency eventually was shut down, and that was the crackdown. But the customs border was maintained. Interesting. Very unusual. So the semi-autonomous state. Finnish universities and schools were to teach many subjects in Russian language. Russian books were sold increasingly in Finland in bookstores. That was one of the ways to make inroads. And in fact, Helsinki, it's the capital of Finland right now. At that time, it was also like provincial capital. Helsinki Public Library was made the second major public library in the Russian Empire that had to receive obligatory, it was obligatory rule that each book printed in the Russian Empire in Russian had to be deposited in two libraries, St. Petersburg National Library and Helsinki Public Library. Okay. Purposely, the Tsar wanted to infest Finland with Russian print culture. Russian print culture. You heard this expression, print culture. Print culture. Print culture, it's an expression introduced by Benedict Anderson, who wrote, you remember the book he wrote? Imagine Communities, right? The Benedict Anderson, he's a historian. By the way, Anderson, Imagine Communities. Of 1989. It's a classical book, Anderson, written by a historian, which explains why nationalism was emerging in modern times, in the wake of industrial revolution, in the wake of this mass education, in the wake of the emergence of the army draft. Okay, and he writes about so-called print culture. He says, if a government begins to print on a mass scale in a standard language, ABC books, maps in the national language, postcards, okay, playing cards, posters, books, flyers, leaflets, newspapers. It creates this print culture, and it railroads nationalism, okay, because everything is done in a standard language. Okay, it's not only about books; it's about print culture in general. Okay, kids go to school, they read Russian books, ABC books, and they are linguistically indoctrinated, if I can say so. Okay, but before they were observing Finnish language, you know, if they look at the poster, okay, same thing. So, Russian government tried to attack Finnish culture from all sides. Okay, and that is why everything was promoted. Postcards, postal system was one of the reasons, because Russians introduced Russification, because Before it was Latin letters they used to write the address, okay? It was postal services that were done in Russia, in the Finnish language. But now all the orders, manuals, memos, addresses on the envelopes, everything was written in Russian. See, willy-nilly you become exposed to the Russian print culture. Okay? And that's how nationalism was promoted. But here, of course, it made a huge disservice because Finnish people were Finnish. They already developed a sense of statehood. They developed a sense of nationhood. Okay? They became so alienated from Russians, they came to hate Russians, just like Polish people, who also used Latin letters, Latin alphabet, like Finnish people. So now they had to learn Russian alphabet. They had to be exposed by force to the Russian print culture, and they didn't like it. Imperial government was undermining gradually, splitting apart its own part. Okay. Another interesting event, it was a gradual, I repeat gradual, I forgot to write it here, gradual beginning of the mass peasant colonization in the East. Primarily people from southern Russia were moving where people were not so captured in the bondage of the commune. Remember, in southern Russia, Ukraine, we have more independent people. We have independent homesteaders. Okay. They tried to move to Siberia, to the new lands, especially to the Far East, to kind of escape the pressure of the imperial government. They tried to tax them more. Those few peasants who somehow were able to buy themselves out from peasant communes also joined this movement. Many Kazakhs also moved there to be away from the watchful eye of imperial government, somewhere in Crimea in southern Russia, way away to be in Siberia, the Far East. So we have 2 million people by 1900 who moved to indigenous lands. Which created this clashes with local people. It's like a movement of settlers to Indian lands in the American West, very much similar. Okay, railroad construction also. Okay, settlers grabbing indigenous lands, a very similar situation. Revolts. That's what I studied in 1990s when I was writing my PhD dissertation. So it was pretty much on this borderland. So how indigenous people of Siberia and the Russian settlers were communicating with each other, fighting each other, intermarriages, trade, revolts. In fact, my minor was Native American history American West, because I tried to draw this comparative analogies.
How did the Imperial Russian government govern these different places? Did they have local leaders, or did they send in Russian governors?
Local leaders, they had governors that governed huge provinces, but in reality the power belonged to local chiefs. Okay? So they were responsible for delivering tribute.
I think, sort of paraphrasing what Dr. Semensky said, like at the beginning of class, the basic idea was like, instead of answering to the Tsar directly, you answered to the governor, and since you were so far away from anything resembling a central administration, it was just, you pay your taxes, you don't cause any trouble, and we'll leave you alone.
Yeah.
And the problem that we're getting to with Alexander's Russification policy is that that way of life is no longer viable for these people, and they're starting to get upset about that.
You know, I didn't say it. You know, but you're correct. You kind of extended. I said, yes, they relied on local chiefs, but everything was changing at the end of the 19th century. Okay? Everything was changing because they tried to do what? They tried to change the status of indigenous nations in Siberia. They tried to put them on the same level with Russian peasants. They tried to standardize administrative system. So thank you so much. So it's a very important comment. And that's what antagonizing, that's what produced revolts on the part of indigenous people. In fact, I studied Altai, this area, it's a southwestern Siberia. I wrote a few articles on this. Here, natives, they even started like a spiritual resistance. They, in mass, started to convert to Buddhism as a challenge to Russian Orthodoxy, because Buddhism was used, Tibetan Buddhism was used as a spiritual resistance. Okay? Because they didn't want this encroachment of indigenous lands. They were afraid, they were petrified that soon they would be paying the same taxes as Russian peasants. Soon they would be controlled by some Russians who would come. The same administrative system. So, and Alexander III actually, yes, he was infringing on their rights in this case. So before they had more privileges, now these privileges started to shrink. Modernization did continue during the second half of the 19th century, despite this conservatism of the Russian Tsar. But where was this industrial revolution, modernization? It's mostly Baltic republics, Poland, and Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's it. European part of Russia. Several major cities, mostly Moscow, St. Petersburg, Poland, Baltic republics, and Finland, of course. Finland, don't forget about Finland. But the rest of the country was still backward, economically backward. No modernization in the core of the empire, in the Russian countryside, which was still very much based on primitive agriculture, subsistence agriculture. And of course, no industrial revolution in Turkestan, where there was people who didn't think about themselves as nationalities. It was still a tribal society. And of course, in Siberia, there was pretty much tribal society as well. In fact, serfdom survived in Central Asia and Turkestan. Serfdom. In Khiva, that was totally observed in the Russian Empire. Formally it was abolished, but informally survived. There was another principality, Muslim principality, that remained in a semi-autonomous state called Bukhara. Bukhara was not observed until 1900, completely was not yet observed. It still had served it, despite the 1861 war. So very much uneven modernization. So that's what we need to keep in mind, this key expression, uneven modernization. I wish I had the map. Like when I tell my students, a week ago we talked about industrial revolution in Europe, and I showed them the map that Northern Europe, England were covered in these dots at places where major factories were started, printing presses. Entire Northern Europe was covered in this dot. Southern Europe was empty. Few factories, more illiterate population. And I wish I had the same map, because in this case, map would have looked like this. You know, the western part of Russia, peppered with factories, industrial factories, textile factories, printing presses. But the eastern part of the empire, Central Asia, totally empty. Go ahead.
Is it because that's where the coal was?
Coal?
Yeah, like the coal that was needed to power the factories. Is that, you know, is that the reason? Like because the coal was, it's not evenly distributed, you know, so you have to build the factories where the coal is, because otherwise you're wasting energy.
Yeah, absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. About social origin of the people, or the economic standing. We can observe by the end of the 1800s, we still can observe this peculiar situation when 90% of Russians, Ukrainians, and Lithuanians, by the way, indigenous Lithuanians, we're not talking about Baltic Germans who were landlords in Lithuania, they were still peasants, backward, primitive agriculture. On the one hand, we have a highly urbanized population, highly educated. Of course, first Germans, they were number one. Oh, by the way, in terms of education, not in terms of the urban residents, in terms of education, the second group of people after Germans were Finnish people. Okay, but they were not too much urbanized. All Finnish peasants owned homesteads, independent homesteads. Few people lived in towns, but almost all of them knew how to read and to write because they were Lutherans. You understand this? Lutherans, Bible reading, you know. we mentioned once, we did talk about it. So Germans, Baltic Germans, 60% of them lived in towns. Poles, 60%, and Jews. Jews were the most urbanized group, biculturally. They had to be urbanized because they were forbidden to enter agricultural occupations. Okay. So what we're talking about here, it's the emergence of nationalisms and ethnic competition. Okay. We have already advanced areas of the empire where industry existed. Not necessarily heavy industry like in Poland, but light industry, textile industry, all kind of industry, which breeds nationalism. By the way, one of the arguments of this guy, Anderson, Emerging Communities, he says that industrial revolution literally breeds nationalism. Why? Because people from different corners of an area, they come to work at the same factory, under the same roof. So industry destroys dialect differences. Railroads, people constantly travel. Education, constantly reading newspapers. So sense of nationalism emerges. So we have this sense of nationalism emerging in Finland, Poland, Ukraine, Armenia. To some extent among Jews, Zionism. You heard about Zionism? Yeah. So the sense of common unity that we are oppressed by these Russians, we live in this reservation called Pale, so let's stick together. On the one hand, we have Russian nationalism. So people, Slavophiles who were breeding Russian nationalism, a sense of envy because Baltic Germans occupied prominent positions. That was the major complaint of Russian nationalism, by the way, not Jews. Jews were anti-Semitic sentiments, but they were not widespread until 1880s. Originally, it was hatred of Germans, competition with Germans for positions in officer corps, in local town self-government, and Zemstva, it's local self-government. So Poles and Russians competed with each other. Russians and Germans started to compete. Alexander III promoted Russian language in major Baltic universities. Especially, Baltic Germans were especially outraged when Alexander III forced students and instructors of old university, Tartu University, Tartu University in what today is called Estonia. It's actually the oldest university in the Russian Empire that had been founded by the Swedish king in 1620. Okay, 1620. It's the oldest university. before this area belonged to Russia, and people constantly used German language, and Alexander III forced them to switch to Russian. It was very much upset Baltic Germans. We have regional tensions, by the way, interesting. So the reason I'm going to mention all these things, because eventually, slowly but surely, all these animosities, they exploded during the First World War and blew away the Russian Empire. Total destroyed. Okay. So we have Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, I forgot to write Lithuanians, peasants, craftsmen, indigenous people, hating German Baltic barons, aristocrats, remember, descendants of Teutonic knights. Because in Baltic republics, Germans were landlords, not Russians. In westernmost part of the empire, Poles and Ukrainians hated Jews, or despised the Jews. Why? Because historically, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth hired Jews to work, to supervise land estates that belonged to Polish nobles. And the immediate, quote-unquote, enemy in the eyes of peasants, Polish peasants and Ukrainians, was a Jewish supervisor. Very dangerous situation. Very dangerous situation. Plus, of course, Jews were not allowed to enter agricultural professions. They had to enter what? Retail business, small workshops. And that's how this legend emerged among grassroots Poles and Ukrainians, that these are bloodsuckers, they suck your money, and the store owners. Tiny stores, grocery stores, were owned by Jews, because they had not been allowed to enter agricultural professions. The Russian Empire had restrictions. So Jews, by the way, were not allowed to practice agriculture in Pale. They had to live in their own communes. The list of restricted occupations. Okay, there was also, I mentioned this eastern expansion of Russian peasant settlers, contradictions between pagan Muslim and Buddhist people on the one side and the Russian settlers on the other side, which also created explosive conflicts later by 1900. So the empire, slowly but surely, was going to its collapse.
Was there any? Were they still fighting? Were the Russians still fighting the Chechens in the Caucasus by that point, or is that all?
Formally, they were defeated in by 1976. Oh, I'm sorry, 1876. 1876. But they still hated being dominated by Russians. Well, and as soon as 1917 revolution happened, the Chechen resistance emerged, and they sided with Turks. Okay. So they harbored this sense of animosity, separatism, because they were violently subjugated. They wanted to be part of the Ottoman Empire, Chechens, part of this Muslim domain. One of the ugliest episodes of his rule, Alexander III, was a bunch of anti-Jewish pogroms. Remember, we mentioned one pogrom, and actually you mentioned this. The first one took place in 1871, the first one, only one. But now there was the whole series of pogroms in southern Russian cities, especially coastal cities like Sebastopol, Odessa, Nikolaev, even in mainland southern Russia, Kiev, present-day Ukraine, Warsaw. 200, it's a lot. I told you that a large number of populists were Jews. because they were highly educated people. They could read, they could understand what was going on. So no wonder many revolutions came from them. And of course, for redneck people, it was explained that Jews killed Alexander II. Okay, that was the, unfortunately, the mass sentiment in not in the countryside. In countryside, people didn't know, hardly knew anything what was going on. We're talking about towns. These marginal people, unemployed, semi-employed, urban masses, urban common people, they nourished these notions that Jews killed Alexander II, and we have to take revenge on them. So that was the official excuse. A bunch of pogroms all over western part of the empire, which of course increased anger on the part of the Jews. So more and more Jews started to join revolutionary movement. More and more of them became socialists. Okay, some of them did not become socialists. Some of them became Zionists. So Jews came to the conclusion there is no safe space for them anymore. So what can you do? You have to band together to create some groups that might defend each other, or we might go to Palestine. So there was a big movement to Palestine. That's when 1881, that's the movement to Palestine begins, the movement to Palestine. Thousands of Jews moved to Palestine who want to go back to the roots, to the soil, to find their own land. Okay. We need to have our Jewish peasantry. See, some of the progressive Jews, they blamed themselves. They said, we lost connection with the land. So we became parasites. So we need to become like a normal nation, because at that time, Russians, Germans, everybody preached this idea that a peasant folk culture, so we should be close to the land. That's what part of nationalism. So we Jews cannot become normal people before we ground ourselves in our native soil. That was the bottom line of this movement. Okay, so there was a bunch of groups, Jewish groups, who were escaping from pogroms, going back to Palestine, setting up communes. Some of them were socialist communes, we talked about last time. Some of them were religious communes, okay, working on the land, purposely picking up swampy, dry lands, because they wanted to test themselves, to show to themselves, to the world, they can become Jewish peasants. They can cultivate this land. All right, but of course, many Jews were not ready to do the sacrifice. You know, many Jews simply decided to find their own heaven where in the West. That is why we have a huge immigration to the United States. Simultaneously with this movement, thousands of Jews. We have hundreds of thousands of people, so more people, moving where? To the United States. That was the major destination. Because it was easy to disappear here, easy to go to find a niche to survive, going to American West. Or the anti-Semitism was not so widespread. It did emerge briefly in 1910, 1920s, when there was a movement in the United States, so nativist movement against immigration. Okay, there were some anti-Jewish sentiments. Jewish at that time, 1920s, or even there were quotas in universities, believe it or not. You know, so Jews were not widely allowed to enter universities in the United States. But before and after, not much. Okay, so it was, this country was open to Jews. Literally open. Okay. But all in all, we have a powerful Zionist movement emergent as a reaction to what Alexander III was doing. What is the Zionist movement? Again, the major message of Zionist movement: we should go to our native land because there is no room for us. We cannot live among other nations. No matter what we do, they will hate us anyway. And the first Zionist Congress was, if I remember, 1893, I think. The first Zionist Congress in Switzerland. That's when Theodor Herzl became the president of Zionist Congress and wrote a famous book called The Jewish State. Judenstaat, in German it was published, Jewish State. Because there was a debate within the Zionist movement, so where we should go. And majority of people, of course, said we need to go to Palestine because it's our land, there's no room for us in Russia or in other countries, in Austria-Hungary. But some people said, oh, a bunch of Arabs live there, let's find some empty spot. Uganda, maybe in Eastern Africa, there was a project. Madagascar, believe it or not, bizarre projects. And Theodor Herzl purposely wrote this book, Jewish State, where he said, no, we shouldn't experiment with these bizarre plans, going to some other areas, because we will simply repeat our sad experience, which we have had in other countries. So we need to go to Palestine, but we don't need to displace Arabs. We need to buy the land. And that's what, unfortunately, sometimes we don't hear. That originally, when the movement was to Palestine, these Jews who were moving there, they were not displacing Arabs. They were buying these lands from absentee landlords. There was a Jewish national fund. So Jewish business people created a big fund to buy these lands. Okay, that's what they did. Of course, in the 20th century, jumping ahead in current times, after these 3 wars between Jews and Arabs, Israeli government took advantage of the situation because Arabs attacked them. They grabbed some land. Okay. So when the war is going on, you have to choose the sides. But originally, I repeat, there was no. It's not incorrect to present this like occupation of Arab lands. Okay. I studied this question because I became interested in this, because when I was in Soviet Union at school, or here when I went to graduate school, nobody told me about how it was going on, because it's such a politically charged area, Jewish immigration. So I went to the books, went to the roots, and now I can say that the land was purchased piece by piece. And Jewish lands that were acquired by the National Jewish Fund, they were granted to Jewish families to work on them, not in a private property. It was not their private property, because there was a fear. If land becomes a private property of a Jewish family, they could sell it to somebody. It was forbidden to sell this land to Arabs. Okay, it was a collective Jewish property. That's how it was treated. All right. So a lot of scapegoating, animosities. Russians were the core of the empire, and Russian intellectuals, Slavophiles, pointed to the core and they said, look, we are miserable, our peasants are poor, see how other nationalities in our empire live, they live much better. We're sacrificing ourselves for their sake, you know, this type of propaganda. Massaging this nationalist feelings. Germans who were also the core of the empire because he worked for the empire. They were being pushed aside slowly, away out, were squeezed out, were being squeezed out from the court, from the army, not overnight, but gradually. Poles and Jews contested the west of the empire, Armenians and Greeks. Greeks controlled in southern Russia, along with Jews, trade, retail business. And Armenians also tried to make inroads into this business, fight over this. Who would control the trade in coastal Russian cities, Crimea, this Black Sea area. Tatars, remember Mongol Tatars? Historically, Western Siberia, it was the part that had been seized by Ivan the Terrible. So here, Tatars who were incorporated into the Russian Empire as part of the elite, they acted as civilizers of indigenous nations. So on many occasions, Tatars who knew Russian language, who received education, they were used by the empire to promote ideas of the empire in Central Asia. Okay? And that is why Central Asian Muslims, for instance, hated some Muslim Tatars who came to promote the empire, impose on them Russian language or something like that. So Muslims, Tatar Muslims, were used by the empire to go to Turkestan and impose on local people this Russian administrative system, Russian language. Scapegoats, we have scapegoats. The major scapegoats were Germans, Jews, and Armenians. So very, very shaky situation that the seeds of discontent were planted by this official nationalities policies. And at the end, I'm finishing my story. I want to bring to your attention the same thing which I mentioned a few times before. Sometimes when we talk about Russian colonialism, it's correct way to describe the Russian policies. But at the same time, it's incorrect way to describe Russian policies. Because Russian Empire, on the one hand, they were the country or the place that also positioned itself against the West. There was an animosity toward the West, this Western domination. On the other hand, Russian imperial agents acted themselves as civilizers in the East, in Central Asia, and in Siberia. See, there's double role. The Russian elite, especially in the court Russians, some Baltic Germans to some extent, but not many because they were close to Europe. They felt that they were treated as savages by Western countries. And they had this sense of insecurity when they compared themselves with the French, with English, okay? And they said that, oh, we are colonized by the French, we are colonized by the Brits, especially when British and French investments started to come to Russia. Railroad construction was conducted by French companies, by some British companies. Banking system was set up by some French banks in Russia, because Russia hardly had any banks. And look, we're colonized by Westerners. Okay? But on the other hand, when such people like von Kaufmann were coming to Central Asia, they were colonizers in relationships with indigenous nations of Central Asia and Siberia. Okay? So it's a peculiar status of Russia. And historians to the present day debate, like those who in Russian studies, was Russia and did it exist, Russian colonialism, or we cannot talk about Russian colonialism? Is it fair to compare Russian Empire with British Empire, French Empire? And some historians say, no, we cannot do it because look what we have. I just described to you this double identity of the Russian elite. On the one hand, they felt they were colonized by the West, but on the other hand, they were colonizers themselves vis-a-vis Eastern people, indigenous people of Siberia, where Central Asia. But definitely Russians were not the master race, okay? And I think part of the reason why these debates are still going on, because by the end of the 19th century, Russian Empire still maintained the traits of this traditional imperial structure, okay? Despite the emerging nationalisms all over the empire, especially in the Western part. We still have the autocratic empire. The major loyalty of people was to the emperor. So it was on the way to die, you know, but the empire didn't die yet, okay? And that's what probably confuses some historians. It was, in the second half of the 19th century, it was like caught into this process of changing. On the one hand, it was still traditional empire, formally. But on the other hand, it was already it was being undermined by local nationalisms, okay, modernization. All these contradictions started to emerge. Okay, that's where we're going to finish.